I need to understand the issues in order to fix them or to attempt to fix them. But I also know that like if you zoom out, the LGBT movement in the United States is like less than 60 years old. We've made incredible progress. And even right now, all these anti-LGBT bills, it's just a backlash to the progress that's happening.
Mm-hmm.
You know, there's that Martin Luther King Jr. quote, like the moral arc of the universe bends towards justice. I see the long run is very positive. We just have to get through this shitty moment and continue being our fabulous selves and continue showing pride because, you know, even look at like Tennessee, like this queer theater in Memphis, Friends of George's, brought the state to court and won. And the drag ban was ruled unconstitutional. We're going to win in the long run. These Republicans, these, you know, far right MAGA folks, they're on the wrong side of history. We're going to win. So as long as we can stay hopeful and see the long view, we're doing great.
Welcome to Deep Dive with me, Sean C. Fettig, and welcome to Pride Month. This is the 53rd annual Pride in the United States. The first, in 1970, happened in New York City to mark the first anniversary of the Stonewall Riots, popularly considered to be a seminal moment in gay rights in the United States, when the queer community, trans folks, gay folks, drag queens, queers of all colors and races, protested the brutal tactics employed by the New York City Police Department to harass and intimidate the queer community. And it was this protest that sent a shot across the bow of law enforcement, as well as the government generally, and society as a whole, that the gay community was no longer going to be a silent victim to abuse and repression. Since then, Pride events in June each year have grown and proliferated in the United States and also outside of our borders, culminating in a month of visibility and celebration. As I will discuss with my guest today, and also in my closing thoughts, these events take on special significance and meaning this year, as the queer community is under a uniquely direct and targeted campaign of hatred and derision, largely driven by the Republican Party and the far-right Christian community in the United States. Today's guest confronts this environment by providing creative outlets for queer artists, creators, performers, and youth to express themselves and showcase their talent in a safe space, but also on the world stage. Adam Odsess-Rubin is the founding artistic director of National Queer Theater and co-founder of the annual New York Times acclaimed Criminal Queerness Festival. We talk about these projects, how and why they've developed, what it's like working in this medium in these challenging times, how National Queer Theater designs programming to provide an outlet for queer people and queer youth, how you can engage, especially as the 2023 Criminal Queerness Festival is just around the corner, corporate pinkwashing, and what the future of the queer community might look like. If you like this episode or any episode, please feel free to give it a like on your favorite podcast platform and or subscribe to the podcast on YouTube. And as always, if you have any thoughts, questions, or comments, please feel free to email me at deepdivewithsean@gmail.com. Let's do a deep dive. Adam Odsess-Rubin, thanks for being here. How are you?
I'm good. How are you, Sean?
I'm well as well. You're on the East Coast, right? And I'm on the West Coast. So What's the weather for you right now?
The weather's pretty good. It's a bit overcast, but it definitely feels like the start of summer and the start of Pride Month. Happy Pride.
Yeah, happy Pride. Cannot say that enough. You know, there were a handful of years, maybe after 2015, so after the Supreme Court recognized the constitutional right to same-sex marriage, and maybe up through like 2019-ish, and it felt, especially on the part of like corporations, like they were just playing to the community without any substance. But this year, I do feel like I want to see a little bit more. I want to see a little bit more pride, even if it is a little substanceless on the part of some like corporations or, you know, even government organizations. I guess I do want to see a little bit of support on their side this year. How do you feel?
I think we always need that support.
Mm-hmm.
I think, you know, for folks who were around at the time of the Stonewall Riots, like the idea, or even folks in other countries that are less LGBT friendly, the idea of having corporate sponsors in Pride is like mind blowing to them. Or the idea of having government walking side by side with activists is kind of mind blowing to them. And as much as I, you know, hate the kind of corporate pinkwashing, that happens in Pride and work very closely with New York City Pride on that issue, I think it's important to get support wherever we can. And, we see when Target puts away their Pride merchandise because of threats from the far right, we see that these corporate partnerships are really shaky. And it really requires people on the inside and activists on the outside putting a lot of pressure, because these companies have a lot of money and a lot of influence that can be really substantial to supporting our community, and does go towards things like supporting Pride or supporting the alleviation of queer youth homelessness, and goes to support a lot of really important nonprofits. And we need to continue that. And they should be investing their money and employees' time and resources and visibility in our community in meaningful ways.
So I do want to circle back and talk maybe about this in the context of maybe some of the work that you're doing in a bit, but are you a little surprised at the response from Target? And I mean, now the US military as well is they're removing Pride flags as well.
Oh, I'm not surprised at all. I mean, I think these companies, for them, supporting Pride campaigns is marketing. They're trying to get gay dollars during June, and they're marketing towards queer people. And as soon as it becomes a liability to market towards queer people and not a source of profit, they'll stop. So, I don't put too much stock in their support. It's superficial. It's to make more money. It's not because they actually care about the lives of queer people, or else they wouldn't spend all their money on these big splashy campaigns. They would actually just give money and not tell anyone,
right?
Which would be the right thing to do. And they would support, Black trans activists and not just the splashiest, shiniest causes.
Mm-hmm. Okay, like I said, we can circle back to this in the context of your work, but let's set the stage, as it were, for why you're here and the work that you do. So tell me a little bit about National Queer Theater, who you are, what you do, why you do it.
Yeah, so I started National Queer Theater in 2018, really to be a home for queer artists here in New York City and around the country. When I was 16, I was in a production of the Laramie Project in my high school in California, when I had been really bullied, and also in the context of the debates around Prop 8. This was during Barack Obama's first campaign for president. And there was just a lot of toxicity against the queer community at the time. And doing that production and being involved in queer activism in this small way on stage, and understanding that I was part of a larger culture and history, was really transformative and really life-saving. And I can draw a direct line between that experience at 16 and starting National Queer Theater when I was 26, I guess 10 years later. And National Queer Theater has become this amazing hub for not only producing LGBT plays, but also a place where LGBT artists can be safe in the workplace, where people can engage in telling queer stories for a queer audience. And then we also offer a lot of free education programs. So later today, I'm going to be teaching a workshop for homeless LGBT youth and New Alternatives in Hell's Kitchen in Manhattan. We also work on a program called Write It Out for people living with HIV. We do programs for youth and refugees and immigrants, and really look at this kind of work holistically.
So you're touching on some of the programming that you do, and I really want to dig into that in a minute. But I think the 30,000-foot view here is that the programming, frankly, there's a lot of it. In a way, it's almost overwhelming to think, that you started this in, like you said, 2018, and here we are I don't know if you're in your sixth year, if you're in your fifth year, but the amount of programming that you have is kind of staggering. So like I said, I want to dig into some of that specific programming, but on a more general plane, I guess I'm wondering, how do you get there from, conception to not only existence, but this much programming and the diversity of your programming? How does that programming come about? How do you identify the programs that you want to stand up? And then how do you engage people both as participants in that programming, but also as consumers?
Yeah, great question. Well, we're not doing all this programming all the time. So it's happening at different points throughout the year, but all of our programming is really based in the needs of the community. So often we're working with community partners on certain issue areas, and we're providing theater education or theater production, and they're doing the direct service work. So for example, before the pandemic, we worked very closely with SAGE, working with queer elders, and SAGE offers food programs, housing programs, healthcare programs for queer elders. And we would come in and do improv workshops and give the queer elders an enriching opportunity to work with young people, to express themselves creatively. And we really worked side by side with SAGE. So all of our programs really come from our community partners and other LGBT nonprofits, usually, or theater nonprofits, where we identified the need in the community and think through how theater and how artists can support that work.
We talked a little bit earlier about like corporate sponsorship, and I don't know the structure of National Queer Theater. So do you engage sponsors or donations or maybe both?
Yeah, most of our work is funded through grants, mostly through private and government foundations. We have one corporate sponsor, which is Gilead Sciences, which is actually the largest funder of LGBT rights in the world. And Gilead's also a really complicated company. They do a lot of great work in queer philanthropy and also really like upcharge their medications that can potentially be life-saving. So I have mixed feelings about Gilead, to be honest. I know that our partners there do too, but we don't actively pursue a lot of corporate sponsorship because I think, just like we were talking about with Target, like these corporations have a pretty nasty history in our community and have not always been supportive and will not continue to be supportive when it impacts their bottom line. So I'm very skeptical about corporate sponsorship, although I recognize that it can be very supportive to nonprofits like National Queer Theater. And, we'll continue exploring that balance with our community.
So there are a handful of things that are of particular interest to me that you do through National Queer Theater that I want to touch base on. But before we get there, I guess I'm wondering, needs evolve in communities, both as society evolves, but as, I guess to some degree, how our political environment, or what it looks like or how it's evolving. In this time, what are you seeing as maybe the programming that is either most in need or that people seem to be seeking out more than others?
Oh, that's a great question. I think for sure in the past 5 years that National Queer Theater has been around, like the biggest area where we see both need and interest is in positive trans representation. I think on the political level, trans rights are at the forefront of our movement right now. And the arts have an important role to play in that because most Americans will say they've never met a trans person, but they can meet trans people through media, through TV, through music, through film, through theater. And so as an arts organization, I think we have a responsibility to showcase positive queer, but even more so positive trans representation, hiring trans actors to play trans roles, hiring trans designers and stagehands, ensuring that critics are not misgendering performers, and really showing the rest of the theater industry how to work with trans artists and how to tell trans stories in a way that's authentic and will contribute to positive and restorative representation.
I've increasingly been thinking lately, especially as in the past couple of years, as the attacks against the trans community have intensified, how the LGB part of the LGBT community really ignored the T for years. And I wonder how much that allowed some room for some of the attacks that we're seeing versus how much this was probably inevitable given, the frankly white gay male community kind of got what it wanted and then to some degree took its money and went home. I'm not sure what the question is in there, but I guess I'm wondering what your feelings or your thoughts are about that. And then I guess what we could learn from that, knowing that this could be a byproduct of some ignorance on the part of the LGBT community.
It's a great question. I think we need to be better at understanding how intersectionality operates within our community because yes, we're all queer, but our lived experiences are radically different from each other because our community is so diverse. And my experience as a white cis gay guy is going to be radically different than a Black trans woman, is going to be radically different from a deaf queer person or a lesbian teen in Montana. And our experiences are impacted by systemic and structural racism, classism, sexism, ableism. And if we don't recognize that, our movement is doomed because we need to build coalition and we need everyone involved in not only supporting LGBTQ rights, but we as queer people need to support other movements. And this was a part of Harvey Milk's work that gets buried really often He spoke a lot about this coalition building with labor movements, with people of color, and the queer community has failed our trans siblings. And with so much focus on marriage equality, once we got marriage equality at the federal level, it was only really then that we started turning towards trans rights, and really reluctantly on the part of some of the bigger, older organizations like the Human Rights Campaign. And it's been a very slow evolution to the point now where it feels like the majority of these queer organizations are focusing on trans rights.
So I think that visibility is important in and of itself, kind of as part of the fabric of our society and who we are. But, as we've been talking about, we're living through a time that's increasingly threatening for queer folks. And then I think in that environment, visibility becomes even more imperative. And taken that, I guess I'm particularly worried about queer youth. And one thing that really predicts positive outcomes for youth is social engagement and connection. And this is irrespective of the detrimental impact that social media can have on youth. We do have research that shows that for queer youth, it actually does contribute positive outcomes, like as it relates to social engagement and feeling connected to the world around them in a way that they might not in their offline lives. So I feel like this is very much the target of some anti-LGBT and anti-trans legislation in a lot of states, is to disconnect folks in a very critical way. It seeks to isolate children from connection with other people that might be like them. And so I think this is why some of the work that you're doing with youth is so important, especially at this moment in time. There are some programs that, you're engineering that I want to talk about, but generally I do want to dig into this. So are you noticing any residual impact of these pieces of legislation, these anti-LGBT, anti-trans pieces of legislation with the youth that you're engaging with? And then if so, how is that manifesting?
Yeah, the impact on this anti-queer and anti-trans legislation on youth is enormous. And the impact is deeply psychological, even for youth in a more progressive state like New York, where it might not be targeting them specifically, but the signal that they're getting from the news, from the media, is that their lives are not important, that their experience is not important, that society does not value them, that the government does not value them, that the country in general doesn't value their existence or their experience. And that is extremely isolating. It's extremely depressing. It creates a sense of anxiety because it could happen in New York. It could come to New York. It could become federal legislation if someone like Ron DeSantis is elected, which, people don't like to talk about on the left, but we have to start to prepare for that possibility. Or even Donald Trump, for that matter, who, flip-flops really on the queer community a lot. But, with our programming in the arts, we try not to focus on that so much. It's really about the flip side of the positive impact of social connection, of building a community of queer youth, of introducing them to positive queer role models who are working on Broadway or off Broadway, of going on field trips to see queer Broadway shows and having fun workshops and guest speakers. We did a Drag 101 workshop with Marsha from RuPaul's Drag Race in our Staging Pride youth program. So we do talk about this legislation. We do talk about transphobia and homophobia, but we try not to let that be the focus, because this is meant to be the kind of medicine. This is meant to be a program that gives these young people joy and hope and building friendships and maybe even a romantic relationship, but something that they're going to take away that's going to help them when the rest of the world feels really crushing and overwhelming, that they feel like they have a supportive community and a space where they can express themselves that sees them as a full human being.
I think this is really valuable. And I'll put this in personal terms, because I think I talk about the disease more than the medicine probably in my life. I am often the person I spend an inordinate amount of time trying to find those pockets and highlight them, where the danger is. And I see two side effects to that. So one is on my own mental health, right? Like I feel not even a sense of fear as much as like anger and anxiety in a way that I haven't felt in many years. But I also think I instill that in other people. So the point I'm making here is that you focus on the medicine, but I'm wondering if you could expound on that a little bit as to what you think focusing on the medicine or what impact that has in a functional way.
Yeah, I mean, my parents growing up, we're both therapists. And I remember asking them when I was a kid, isn't it depressing to listen to people's problems all day and these horrible situations? And both of them were like, no, we get to help people. Like, isn't that amazing? We get to help them solve their problems. So that's how I look at working in LGBT rights is, yes, there's so many issues. There's so many horrible things happening right now. And you can open a newspaper and you could not leave your bed all day because it's so awful. But every day, I also work with incredible queer artists. I work with amazing queer youth. I work with inspiring LGBT activists and nonprofit organizations who are making our community just the most fabulous it can be. And I'm so inspired every day. I feel incredibly optimistic, especially when I'm working with young people and our students who are so brilliant and so ahead of where I was when I was a teenager. So for me, the future feels very bright. I read scripts in development that are going to be the next, LGBT Broadway shows. They're the next Rent. They're the next Angels in America. And the kind of work that's being done right now is insanely good and diverse and thoughtful and thought-provoking and provocative. So I try not to let myself dwell on the negative, acknowledging the reality. I mean, I'm not living in La La Land. I need to understand the issues in order to fix them or to attempt to fix them. But I also know that, like, if you zoom out, the LGBT movement in the United States is like less than 60 years old. Mm-hmm. We've made incredible progress. And even right now, all these anti-LGBT bills, it's just a backlash to the progress that's happening. Mm-hmm. There's that Martin Luther King Jr. quote, like, the moral arc of the universe bends towards justice. I see the long run is very positive. We just have to get through this shitty moment and continue being our fabulous selves and continue showing pride because, even look at like Tennessee, like this queer theater in Memphis, Friends of George's, brought the state to court and won. And the drag ban was ruled unconstitutional. We're going to win in the long run. These Republicans, these, far right MAGA folks, they're on the wrong side of history. We're going to win. So as long as we can stay hopeful and see the long view, we're doing great.
Well, I appreciate that outlook. Let's talk about two of the programs. I'm cherry picking two programs that you have for youth because they're absolutely the type of things that I would have been super interested in as a kid. So I'm hoping you can tell me a little bit about them. And what I'm talking about is Staging Pride and then the Rainbow Connection Queer Theater Camp. I mean, I would have died as a kid if these were options for me. Maybe tell me a little bit about them, how they work, what you do, and also how, people listening could engage with these programs if they're interested.
Yeah, absolutely. So a few years ago, Sheila Morgan from the Arts Project of Cherry Grove and Fire Island reached out to National Queer Theater asking if I could recommend teachers for a new intergenerational theater camp in Fire Island. And I very selfishly was like, I'll do it. I had experience working intergenerationally through teaching at New York Theater Workshop. And, I knew I could pull it off and started teaching there on Fire Island in the summer with my good friend Gavin Trinidad, who's an amazing educator and artist. And then this past year, we decided, let's just make this a partnership with National Queer Theater and really expand this program. And it's amazing. It's this, a theater camp on Fire Island. It's so fun. And it's so enriching for both the teens and elders who are part of this program, having conversations about what it means to be queer through different generations. And then they write and perform their own variety show at the end at the little theater by the dock in Cherry Grove. It's really beautiful. So for any elders listening who might spend their summers on Fire Island, or any youth who live in Long Island, or parents, teachers, check out Rainbow Connection. And then Staging Pride really came from our longstanding relationship with the LGBT Center in Manhattan, and Richard Morales there, who runs the arts programs, and then funding from the Matisse Foundation, who have been an incredible sponsor for Staging Pride Queer Youth Theater, which was inspired by a similar program in Boston created by the Theater Offensive that is really amazing. And so young people come to the center once a week for 2 hours and work with our teaching artists, Amy Ackerman and Kevin Smith Kirkwood. And they learn about LGBT history and culture, and then also write and rehearse and perform their own original show including monologues and scenes and songs and spoken word, and really just build this kind of microcosm of queer community and mutual support through the 12-week program. And we're excited to continue growing that.
Okay, I want to pivot and talk a little bit about something that actually is initially what brought you to my attention was the Criminal Queerness Festival.
Yeah.
So I want to talk a little bit about that. But before we talk about the festival itself, I think maybe we need to define the concept of criminal queerness. We've talked a little bit about, the existential issue that being queer to some degree has always been, but we're seeing crackdowns in numerous parts of the world, particularly in Africa and Southeast Asia. But as we've talked about, we're experiencing this in the United States as well, that just the act of existing queer is becoming an existential crisis for us. So I'm wondering, before we talk about the festival itself, if you could put us in the headspace for this conversation by defining what is criminal queerness.
Yeah, so the term criminal queerness was coined by one of our artists, Nick Kadikwa Muluko, who grew up in Tanzania and Kenya and lives in the US now. And it really is talking about the experience of LGBT people in countries where essentially being gay is illegal, or having a non-normative gender identity or expression. And this is about 70 countries, about half the countries in the world outlaw homosexuality in some form. And the effect that it has on the arts and artists is essentially total censorship. So if you're an LGBT artist in Saudi Arabia or Indonesia, you can't write a play about queer people. You can't sing a song about queer people. You can't create a film or documentary about queer people. And so there's virtually almost no representation, or it's all underground. And this used to be the case in the United States. I mean, pre-Stonewall, that was basically how it was. It was criminalized. And although there is a lot of LGBTQ legislation being passed today, it is not, in my view, comparable to what's happening in Uganda or Iran right now.
Yeah. I'm glad you make this point. I've had this conversation on a couple of other episodes of Deep Dive with folks about, what's happening in the United States and then how we situate that relative to what's happening in some other countries, wherein, like Uganda, being queer comes with a death sentence, right?
Yeah.
And how we both lend weight to what's happening in the United States. Like in Florida, pride marches are being canceled for fear that they might run afoul of new law. How do we lend weight to that, but also recognize that in the United States, we're still coming from a very privileged space when we compare ourselves to places like, Uganda and Iran, as you mentioned?
Well, I think it's all on a spectrum, right? Like Uganda and Iran are on one extreme of very violent and deadly homophobia and transphobia. And on the other side of the spectrum is like Norway or Sweden, which are some of the most tolerant countries in the world. And the United States is more towards that end of the spectrum, but feels like it's being pulled to the right, especially since the emergence of Trumpism, of MAGAism, and now with DeSantis. And it's always been on this spectrum. So in some ways, we're very progressive. And, people love to hate on Biden, but he's been very LGBT. He's been very progressive on LGBT issues. But then we have this whole states' rights thing. So we have some states that feel like they're on one end of the spectrum and other states that feel like they're on the opposite end of the spectrum. And, our society is just really divided. But I think, living in a liberal bubble like New York, I can recognize that things are pretty good here. They're not perfect. I can recognize that things are really tough in Florida right now. I can also recognize that things in Kenya are on a totally different level. And they all exist on this spectrum of acceptance to, hatred. I think another difference, though, is also that even in a state like Florida, while the government might be really homophobic and passing all these laws, the people aren't necessarily as hateful, or, some of them are conservative, but it's not as bad, I think, as the government is. Whereas in a country like Uganda, the vast, vast majority of the public is also incredibly homophobic. And even if you're not arrested by the government, by the police, you can still get beat up in the streets or fired from your job.
So what is the Criminal Queerness Festival? What are its origins and how's it evolved? Because this is an annual festival, correct?
Yeah, so in 2018, I got a play in my email inbox called Drowning in Cairo by a young gay playwright from Egypt named Adam Ashraf El Saik. And I remember talking to Adam on Skype, and I asked him if he had done this play about the gay history of Egypt in his country. And he laughed at me and was like, no way, we'd all be arrested. And I was like, oh, shit, of course.
Mm.
And so I asked him, like, how many other writers do you think are out there who, may have LGBT plays that can't do them in their home country? And he was like, probably hundreds or thousands. So, talking with Adam and talking with my friend Nick from Tanzania, we put together this idea for a festival that would really be a place where we could showcase artists like this, plays like this in New York, which has a lot of freedom of expression, where that's constitutionally protected, and basically do a series of censored queer plays during Pride Month in New York City. And that started in 2019 during World Pride at this little theater near Stonewall called IRT Theater. And it got included in the New York Times, like, top things to do for World Pride. And then it just kind of blew up, and we got this big grant from the city in 2020. We had to move online, but even online, the beautiful thing was that people from all over the world were able to watch these play readings on Zoom. Even in countries that would normally censor queer work, the government didn't censor Zoom. I don't think they knew how to differentiate between a business meeting and a queer play reading.
Right.
So we had people in Iraq and Syria and Tanzania, like, listening to these plays, which was amazing, or people in Nebraska or Texas. And then coming out of the pandemic, we were invited to bring this festival in Lincoln Center. And that's just brought it to a whole new platform, and really showcasing these incredible writers at, one of the most prestigious venues in the world, really, and elevating their work as it should be elevated.
So then tell me about the festival this year. What's on deck? What do you have planned?
Yeah, so in previous years, we've produced a lot of work from the Middle East and from East Africa. And, talking with artists, I never wanted to seem like this thing only happened in those places, and that this wasn't a global issue, and it wasn't an issue at home. And when the war in Ukraine started, thinking about my own family origins coming from Ukraine during the pogroms in the, early 20th century, I felt a responsibility to help share these stories, because Ukraine is actually pretty LGBT friendly for Eastern Europe, but Russia is not. And if Russia does take over all of or part of Ukraine, they will bring their homophobia and transphobia with them. So this year is really focusing on the war in Ukraine and Eastern European artists who in the past have been too afraid to submit to this festival. But this year we're working with an incredible cultural consultant, Alexander Kropivkin, who's also the lead in one of the shows. And we're doing plays by 2 Ukrainian artists and 1 Polish artist. And we're just excited to engage with folks at this intersection during Pride, as this war continues spiraling, looking at what is the impact on LGBT Ukrainians in the country and also now in the diaspora. What is the impact of this war, and how do we include queer Ukrainians when we think about Pride this year?
So if people are interested in participating in some way, how can they do that? Is this all in person again?
This is all in person. So the festival is happening June 21st to 23rd at the David Rubenstein Atrium at Lincoln Center, and all tickets are totally free. It's first come, first serve, open to the public. It's a beautiful space, and we're really proud to showcase these new plays to a New York audience. And the beauty of this festival is that we both get people who see their own stories represented on stage, and we'll have queer Ukrainians in the audience and queer Polish people in the audience and seeing their own stories represented. And then people who knew nothing about these countries or know nothing about these stories who are getting an inspiring educational experience, and we can have that dialogue together. So yeah, I encourage everyone to come check it out. And, it's a great thing to do during Pride for people that are interested in the more activist side of Pride. I know there's a celebration, there's a lot of parties, and we can do that too. But as we've been talking about, there's a lot of issues out there. And, I think Pride needs to be a protest, and we need to recognize that the roots of Pride are in the Stonewall Riots, which was really a protest against police brutality. So it's really in that spirit that we do this festival with New York City Pride.
Did you say it's totally free?
It's totally free. West Lincoln Center.
Okay, so we've talked about this quite a bit throughout this episode, but not to put too fine a point on it. But I guess I do want to put a point on it. So, given the work that you're in and the increasingly threatening environment that we're living in on a personal level, how do you process and stay sane and stay healthy? And then do you have any type of a message to share with folks listening that might need to hear that there are safe spaces for them that still exist?
Oh, there are so many safe spaces that exist and so many amazing organizations in New York, but also in like really places you wouldn't expect in the middle of Colorado or the middle of Alaska, who are doing amazing work in the queer community. And a lot of that stuff is available online, or at least, you can find resources on the internet, on Instagram, on TikTok. There's a lot more out there than people think there is. On a personal level, it is really taxing. I mean, running any nonprofit is really taxing, but especially when it's so tied to your own identity, I just think I have a lot of privilege, and I want to use that privilege towards the good of our community. And I look at folks around the world as just an extension of my family. I think what keeps me going is the great work that people are doing, is the artists that I get to work with who are so talented, so expressive. Last night I hosted a drag show that was so fun and just showed off the best of our community. And every day is a struggle to practice better self-care. I think a lot of us are struggling with that, and New York is a very intense grind. But I don't trust in pessimism or hopelessness. I look really for the beauty in our community. I get to see a lot of really great shows, from Broadway to the basement of a gay bar, and see all the incredible work our community is doing and what queer artists have to offer the world.
So how can people that are interested engage with you, with National Queer Theater, and support the work that you're doing?
Yeah, I would love for folks to follow National Queer Theater on Instagram, on Facebook at National Queer Theater. Check out our website, nationalqueertheater.org. If you are an artist that's interested in working with us, you can email info@nationalqueertheater.org. That's theater with an ER. And if you're so moved, we always need donations, and people can make a tax-deductible donation at nationalqueertheater.org to support our artists and our continued work in the community, bringing arts and culture into the queer movement.
Okay, final question. And I frankly, I feel like this episode has answered this question. However, I'm wondering what's something interesting you've been reading, watching, listening to, or doing lately, and it doesn't have to be related to this topic.
I just directed a show at the Eagle in New York City. This was like a freelance directing gig. This play was called Slap and Tickle. And it really got me interested in researching gay bars and queer bars and why they mean so much in our community. And I picked up this book that one of my board members recommended to me called Gay Bar, Why We Went Out by Jeremy Atherton Lynn. And it's phenomenal. It's such a good, fun, sexy read. That also is packed with a lot of interesting history and context around queer bars as safe spaces. So yeah, I really recommend that. And then I've also just been like watching a lot of like trash TV just to decompress, because the work can be really intense sometimes. And, sometimes I just want to watch Top Chef and veg out and eat potato chips. And that's also great.
I was so like, ooh, what trashy TV? But Top Chef, like that's literally top shelf of trashy TV. Like that's not what I thought you were going to say.
I really like cooking shows. I don't know why.
Yeah.
They're just like, you can just kind of turn your brain off.
Did you see that Padma's leaving?
I did. I love Padma, but like, good for her. She needs to move on.
Yeah, for sure. But I mean, I don't watch Top Chef like I used to, but she was personality-wise the primary reason I watched it.
Well, she's just like this, like queer icon. Like she's such a diva. She's so beautiful and so poised and so smart. I'm obsessed. Because like I don't need to watch like Tom Colicchio. Like
I don't like him. I'm sorry. Forgive me for anyone listening, but he turns me off.
Yeah, he's kind of smug.
Yeah, and I think he's getting worse.
Yeah.
Anyway.
We'll start Padma Nation. And
have you watched it?
Her new show? Yeah, it's good. It's good.
Okay, well, there's a plug. Adam, thanks for being here. I've really enjoyed the conversation. And, I'd love to circle back with you after the festival to talk more if you're open to it.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Sean. We're queer all year, so it doesn't have to end in June.
Love it. On Tuesday of this week, June 6th, the Human Rights Campaign issued its first ever emergency declaration, stating that, quote, LGBTQ plus Americans are living in a state of emergency. The multiplying threats facing millions in our community are not just perceived, they are real, tangible, and dangerous. In many cases, they are resulting in violence against LGBTQ plus people, forcing families to uproot their lives and flee their homes in search of safer states, and triggering a tidal wave of increased homophobia and transphobia that puts the safety of each and every one of us at risk. End quote. This statement rings especially true as on the same day, Tuesday, anti-LGBTQ protesters in Glendale, California, physically attacked LGBTQ supporters as the school district voted to recognize Pride Month. It's for this reason that this year's Pride Month takes on special importance. This is a time to celebrate. The queer community has come extremely far in a very short period of time, but it is also a time to be vigilant. As the Human Rights Campaign notes, more than 75 anti-LGBTQ bills have passed in the United States in just the first 5 months of this year, and violence against the community is on a sharp rise. And Adam's words in this episode resonate with me. Pride is a protest. We should carry that message with us. Our existence is a protest. And while I urge caution and vigilance, especially in this time of heightened violence against the community, I want to also remind you that you are strong and resilient, and you have agency. Together, as a community, we are not entirely without an ability to protect ourselves, to push back, and to prevail. We may be victims of violence and hatred, but we don't have to internalize that victimization. We are better than these unhinged oppressors. We are good. We are gentle. We are compassionate. We are democratic. And we represent the best of humanity. Internalize that. Carry that with you. Be proud. Be strong. And of course, be safe. All right. Check back soon for another episode of Deep Dive. Chat soon, folks.